You've built an entire organization around the premise that that's what we do. We find things, or we identify things, we say which ones to go after, and then we go through the process to try and remediate them. And then, at the top of that is, how do we sift through what to even respond to? When everything's red, when everything's flashing, nothing's flashing in a sense, right? It's alert overload, which I think you kind of said. It's where do we spend our time? What's important? What do we go after at this point? So that reactive approach just inundates teams with what do we go after? How do we spend our time? It takes intense man hours and such a workload. I mean, that's why we have security operations centers.
Welcome back to Between Fires and Futures. I'm your host, Tonya Terrell. AI is exposing security gaps most companies don't even realize they have. And the bigger issue is most teams are still set up to react, not prevent. Security teams are overwhelmed with alerts. They're responding to threats after they've already made it inside. And at the same time, AI is accelerating both sides of the equation. More sophisticated attacks on one side and more risk inside organizations as employees start using AI tools every day. So the question becomes, is the way we've been approaching cybersecurity still working, or are we solving the wrong problem entirely? And that's what we're getting into today. I'm joined by John Fraser, a cybersecurity strategist with over 2 decades of experience operating at the intersection of national security, enterprise IT, and modern threat defense. He's a certified information systems security professional who's advised organizations across both federal and commercial sectors on how to adapt their security strategies to keep pace with increasingly sophisticated adversaries. His background spans mission-critical Department of Defense programs, large-scale enterprise environments, and high-growth SaaS ecosystems, giving him a very practical perspective on where traditional security models start to break down. He's held leadership roles at Trinity Cyber, Securonics, Akamai, and Booz Allen Hamilton, working on everything from global threat initiatives to enterprise-scale cybersecurity modernizations. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this because, AI is exposing these security gaps that most companies don't even realize they have. So from what you're seeing, what are those gaps inside organizations right now in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing overall is just rogue AI usage, right? So we have so many tools that we're using and employing today that we're just not even aware of what's out there. It used to be, IT, sprawl. What systems do we have running? Who's running some rogue, server in a closet somewhere that's running some application? Now that's drifted into AI, right? So think of, the examples I think of like all the things called Copilot nowadays, right? Everything's got a Copilot. Well, to me, that literally means there's somebody there's an AI engine running, shotgun to everything that you're doing. It's ingesting all of that data and then processing it in their cloud for the most part, right? So what access are we giving these tools? Where is the data flowing? What is it commingling with? That's a big one for me is just what AI tools are we even using today? We have corporate apps, we have homegrown, AI apps. We have things that are attached onto the cloud applications that we're using. And then of course you have, things like LLM usage, so the language learning models, all the GPTs that are out there, right? So, for example, we probably all or most of us have one sitting on our phone right now, whether we even know it or not. You look at, for those of us with an iPhone, Siri, in some example, or those who have running apps, whether it's, Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever. If I go to Google, for example, I get the pop-up every single time I do a search that's AI. How many times are we seeing employees taking, maybe what they think is innocuous data, a spreadsheet or something out of their shared drive and dumping that into an LLM and say, hey, I just need this summarized. Well, you've now basically put that data out into a cloud environment that you don't own and you don't control. So it's now been put in the public domain. So I think there's a lot of examples out there where, these emerging things through AI are really taking a foothold. Another just kind of last example is all the coding tools, right? So I, for example, when some of these coding tools came out, I'm not a developer by trade, but it was really cool to go and kind of build these apps and connect these systems. And, luckily for me, I had the foresight to do it in, a laptop that I was kind of, that was collecting dust on the side. But you've got people in organizations that are doing that potentially on a work device, right? They're going to the command line or the terminal and copying, pasting prompts from their coding tool with no coding knowledge whatsoever. And those are connecting to systems that they have no idea what the implications are. That poses a huge risk to organizations. We copy, paste, hit enter, and yeah, we might get this cool app that's making our job easier, but we have no idea what back-end systems that's connected to. I think that's just a huge threat right now for organizations. And I think we're seeing that every day. I mean, I can't tell you the number of customers or prospects that I talk to that say, well, what can you tell me about AI usage in my environment, right? So you can just see it's frothing in the corporate environment today, and organizations are really trying to get their hands around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because on paper, everyone says they're proactive, right? Everyone says they're modernized, but really in practice, I know we're talking to IT leaders every day. And the number one thing that we hear is, I want to be proactive, but we're
Sure.
very reactive. So what we're seeing on paper, what they're claiming is not what they're actually saying. So in practice, teams are not only like drowning in alerts and chasing issues after the fact, but they're spending more time responding than actually preventing anything. And that's a scary thought in this day and age.
Yeah. And so you transition from AI, where you don't know what it's doing in your organization, to how do we even respond to not even just AI threats, but just threats in general. I think that happens across the organization, especially in IT, but more specifically within the security organization, right? They're really responsible. They're the ones with the funding to stop the threats. So in IT themselves, sure, you have a server that's reading, low on disk space, for example. You have to respond to those alerts. But the ones that really get the most attention, that really bog us down, are in that cybersecurity function within the IT organization. They're traditionally still driven by the alert, respond, triage, remediate, and recovery, kind of life cycle or methodology. And to escape that is hard. It's really hard because you've built an entire organization around the premise that that's what we do. We find things, or we identify things, we say which ones to go after, and then we go through the process to try and remediate them. And then, at the top of that is, how do we sift through what to even respond to when everything's red, when everything's flashing, nothing's flashing in a sense, right? It's alert overload, which I think you kind of said. It's, where do we spend our time? What's important? What do we go after at this point? So that reactive approach just inundates teams with, what do we go after? How do we spend our time? It takes intense man hours and such a workload. I mean, that's why we have security operations centers. Those were literally created out of the need to get our hands around this reactive approach to security. And I think you really see that, like I said, in the security organizations, probably more than any other. IT certainly bears the top level umbrella of that. But I think if you asked anybody within their organization, that reactive approach is certainly built into the security environment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think most security still revolves around that detect and respond. And I mean, detect and respond sounds like it's the right approach. It sounds responsible. So why is that model no longer enough?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at some of the solutions out there today that are using that kind of DR, detect and respond mentality, a lot of them refer to mean time to respond, or MTTR. And they tout the fact that they can do it in minutes. Under 10 minutes is kind of exceptional in that space. And when you look at it, when you get a white paper, you're at a booth at a show, 8 minutes to respond, 10 minutes to respond sounds incredible until you understand the cybersecurity landscape. And we'll probably get into the AI effects of that, I assume, a little bit later. But just taking ransomware, for example. So 3 to 5 years ago, we measured ransomware attacks in days. 24 days of when they first got access to when you got ransomware. Then it turned into hours. Okay, it was 24 hours and you got ransomware. I mean, as of 2025, I think even Palo Alto said it was down to 25 minutes. And that was a year ago. So you can imagine we're probably in the single digit minute of ransomware attacks where an attacker gains access and all of a sudden your systems are locked down in minutes. Now, take that on the other side of that mean time to respond, which is also around the same time. You're really up against a challenge there from a detect and respond standpoint. If your mean time to respond is equal or greater than the time for an attacker to get in and lock down your system and generate a ransomware demand, you're really hoping and praying that detect and respond is going to be as accurate as possible. When you layer in all the alerts that are coming in on top of that, with the spray and spray and pray approach that adversaries use, it only takes that one time to get through. And what I think we'll get into a little bit later, I hope, is how AI is it's accelerating that, right?
Yeah. Let's get into that. So, how is AI changing the way attacks are being created and executed, and how is it accelerating that?
Yeah, I think I don't think it's the way that most people think, right? So it kind of goes back to, what we used to talk about with, like what you would see on TV. Like every time you saw like a security operations center or how somebody infiltrated a network on TV, it looked very cool and sexy. I think people assume that about AI threats as well. And honestly, the tactics and techniques that adversaries are using haven't really changed in the last decade or maybe even 2 decades. So it hasn't gotten like AI has come up with these novel new attack methods. Maybe they stream some of those tactics and techniques together. They string them together to create other avenues of attack. But what it really allows is a faster and more broad approach to cybersecurity attacks. I'll give you an example. So let's take steganography. So hiding something malicious in something that's otherwise benign, right? So we see this with like image files all the time. An adversary can take an innocuous image, append some malware onto the end of it, and then basically host it on a website, embed it in a PDF, what have you, right? I can do that maybe one or two times, on my desktop. I can write the code or whatever. Imagine if you're using some of those AI tools to basically say, okay, now do that 1,000 times. I mean, we've all used AI image generation at this point. I can scroll and images are just getting created over and over and over again, right? If I can take those images and append that malware onto every single one of those images, I've now created a new signature. I've created a new hash value that every single firewall and cybersecurity team now has to go and update their systems with. So it really compounds the fact that, this AI usage can just, it just creates a volumetric approach to how adversaries are using, these tactics and techniques to their advantage. The techniques aren't changing. It's allowing just that kind of, again, spray and pray approach to what they're able to do. Another kind of cool example, maybe cool for us cybersecurity, folks, but we're seeing malware payloads themselves actually changing. We saw an example of this maybe about 6 months ago, where an adversary was taking a language learning model, so think a ChatGPT or a Gemini or whatever, and they were actually taking the malware code. So obviously they were using probably some open source solution, because typically, our public ChatGPTs and Geminis of the world wouldn't let you do this, but they were literally taking the malware code and they were going into, an open source, dark web LLM model and saying, hey, take this code, but at this point, I want you to inject classic rock lyrics from the 60s. Just put 2 lines of classic rock lyrics into this code. So what does that do? Well, it creates a new malware signature. And if I go back into the LLM and say, okay, do that 1,000 times with different lyrics every single time, I've now created 1,000 signatures and 1,000 different pieces of malware that all look a little bit different just with a simple prompt in an LLM. So it's kind of crazy, how easy it's become for an adversary to do that.
Yeah, it really is. And I was reading something, I think the World Economic Forum called out that AI is really lowering the barrier to entry for cybercrime. So
100%.
So is it that like you just don't need to be as sophisticated as you used to be for cybercrime? Would you say that's true?
I think it's true. I think that's been happening before even AI usage, right? I mean, we saw that, I came out of, in back in the days when DDoS was real big, right? There used to be DDoS for hire, where you could just go and pay somebody and they would go and DDoS a company on your behalf, and it was all dark money and you probably paid them with Bitcoin and things like that. I think what's now happening is those same tools are at the fingertips of every adversary who wants to do something nefarious, right? So I have AI tools that I can create my own code without any coding experience. I can say, hey, see if you can put these 2 techniques together to give me something new or some other vector of attack that maybe nobody's seen before. So yeah, it's really opened up the door for adversaries of, with any sort of skill type to go in and try to do things. Now, luckily, I think we've been fairly successful in being able to stop a lot of this stuff, but eventually, it's the constant battle, right?
Yeah.
It's how do we keep up with the new tools that are coming? So
Right.
staying
Right.
ahead of what the threat is.
Right. And then there's the internal side too, employees using AI tools every day, right? You talked about that at the beginning. So what risks are companies unintentionally introducing there?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to like the LLM model is an easy example, right? We don't know what employees are putting into those language learning models. You think about a shared drive, right? Think
Right.
about somebody in HR who's, I don't know, trying to write a bunch of job descriptions, for example. So they say, hey, I'm going to just dump all these job descriptions into my LLM, and I just want you to summarize them and give me the best bits of all of them, or grade them on me, rewrite these for me. That might sound, somewhat benign on its surface, but what if those job descriptions, what if you're an HR staffing firm and those job descriptions are proprietary to, it's like intellectual property, right?
Mhm.
So, that's a simple example, but it kind of just shows the scale at which this can get out of control, right? You
Right.
can take anything and start putting it into an LLM, and unless, even if you're using an enterprise version, that's still going to a cloud environment that you have no control over.
Mhm.
And if you read through all the use policies and the terms and conditions for all these AI usage things, they're going to cover themselves to be able to
Yes,
say,
they
hey,
are.
you put this in the model,
Yeah.
we can't contain all the data, and that data then becomes publicly available. Yes, it's commingled with all sorts of other data, but is that really what an organization is going to say? Yeah, that's doing what it needs to do. I think the other pieces there are, the coding tools that we talked about. All of a sudden, I can write an application that says, hey, I want you to start auto responding to my emails in the morning. And at the same time, I want you to brew me a cup of coffee, right? Using some sort of IoT device. Well, that's obviously a silly example, but imagine if those two systems started talking to each other, or if you had a system an IoT device that would never normally talk to another business system that you've now connected together. Email is a great example because email is such a classic attack vector, right? Attachments that have malicious payloads in them, links that go somewhere that they shouldn't. I would doubt that any CISO in the world would want their email system talking to some IoT device on the same network, right?
Right.
And then there's other things too, unvetted plugins. We talked about the co-pilots that sit on the side of your email or whatever else. And then there's the prompt injection stuff too. So there's the nefarious actions of the other side of AI, where maybe you get something that's a prompt back that you don't know is malicious, but it's telling you something that you shouldn't. Now that's less likely in a classic, language learning model that we would probably use as a desktop version. But I will tell you, there will be cases, if there aren't already, and I'm sure someone could cite me here and say that there have, where a prompt injection, somebody does something that they didn't know was intentional, and all of a sudden they've exposed a system or granted access to somebody who was trying to do
Wow.
something nefarious.
Wow. I mean, what I'm really hearing you say is that, like, the surface area for attack, it just feels overwhelming.
Yeah,
What
for
is
sure.
what is a security leader supposed to do?
I think you have to be from a larger standpoint, you have to be aware of, from an AI perspective, you have to be aware of what's in your network, right? You have to have some sort of visibility and control. I get asked that all the time. Can you tell me what users are using AI? Can you tell me if there's any sort of rogue AI usage in my organization? So what is that really asking? It's asking for visibility. It's asking for the type of visibility that most solutions aren't going to offer, because they're looking at the back end. They're looking at that detect and respond. So really, it's that full content level inspection of everything across the network. And that includes both north-south, so that's inbound and outbound. So think of all the network traffic coming in and out of your network, but also east-west. So what's going across your network? So what's connecting your HR system to your accounting system, and what users are in between? Having that visibility into all of that and then being able to take action preemptively, I think, is really where organizations need to shift to, is how do we put that at the frontmost line of defense and do it in a way that we're not having to wait on that mean time to respond, but we're doing something in almost real time.
Yeah. So this preemptive approach, can you walk us through what that actually would look like in practice?
Yeah, I think from our perspective and from my perspective, it's something that's sitting in line, but that doesn't inhibit business operations, right? So if you are able to do, a full content inspection approach where you can sit not only outside the perimeter, but also within the walls of the organization or on a user's device and look at that full session, that full internet session, or that full network session of what is happening, and then be able to actually take action on what is malicious within that session. So the approach, I think the methodology there is moving away from detect and respond and moving fully toward something that can operate in line, that can look at a threat as it's decomposing that session, pluck it out, and then basically repackage that session and send it along its way. That I think is really the key element because it takes the human-centric approach out of it, right? What you're basically doing at that point is on the back end, you can have humans that are reviewing the actions that were already taken, but you're not relying on them to go through a mountain of alerts to say, yep, let's go after this one, let's skip this one, let's let these pile up because we can't get time, we don't have time to get to them. I think that's really key in the preemptive approach, moving away from that kind of detect and respond.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I think a lot of the certainly the IT leaders, more so than the security leaders, feel, but some of the security leaders that we're interacting with on a daily basis feel like they've addressed this with zero trust. So
Sure.
where does that approach fall short?
I think so. I mean, I feel like zero trust has been around for 20 years now, 15, 10 at a minimum, right? I think the original approach is still sound, right? We have to not trust our users. We have to not trust our devices. We have to have implicit zero trust when it comes to that. But that's really where the focus generally is: user and device authentication, and then allowing or disallowing, implying zero trust on the actions that they can take, right? We talk about microsegmentation, those sorts of things. Just because a user is authenticated doesn't mean that the actions that they're taking are still safe, right? Most of the attacks that we're seeing today are still from verified credentials. A lot of the preemptive attacks that we see on these enterprise organizations is they go and get the credentials first, then they gain access to do the things they nefariously want to do, whether it's, data exfiltration, ransomware, what have you. So, verifying a user through multi-factor authentication, and that's all sound, and we should all be doing that. But we can't just rely on authentication alone. I think what we really need to take into account is what's happening after that user gains authentication, right? How is that user, what is that user doing? What's inside, kind of going back to that session, what's happening in that session and the applications that they're accessing that we need to be aware of. Not only be aware of and have visibility, but also be able to take actions on. The great example is we moved from a lot of times VPN to zero trust. That was kind of the corporate VPN, ZTNA and zero trust was kind of the replacement for that, which I think in a way solved a lot of the challenges because it did give you visibility from someone working outside of the organization. But I think what we really need to do is have a security first approach to that zero trust, being able to take preemptive actions on something nefarious, even with an authenticated user in line, both inbound and outbound across that network, but also across the network as well. So inbound and outbound and also across the network. I think ultimately what it really comes down to is you have to have zero trust of the traffic as well as the user and the device. So you really can't stop at, okay, I know this user has access to this device and this application from this location. We also have to look at the traffic that's coming in and out of that device or that user to say, okay, is what they're doing safe? Is that what they're doing? And actually, if you go back to the AI analogy, that's a perfect example. If I've granted, or don't have controls for AI usage or don't have visibility, that person may be doing something that they believe is safe. But I'm sure if the CISO saw what was going into that LLM, they'd probably be pretty concerned. So that's just a small kind of bringing it full circle back to AI. But that's I think where zero trust, I think as a framework is great. And I think as what's kind of evolved as technology as a first kind of stepping stone or a halfway point. I think the second half of that is really making a security first approach and not trusting the user, the device, but also the traffic.
So if someone listening realizes that they're more reactive than they should be, what's the first shift they should make?
Well, they can call me. No,
Yeah.
no,
And we'll link your information in the show notes.
no. I think the biggest thing is we talked about alerts. Like, are you an organization that's just like inundated with alerts? I mean, is it something that you're constantly adding headcount? You're running a SOC, or your single or two, three IT guys are just completely overwhelmed with everything that they're getting inside, their reporting systems every day. I think that's a big one. That's a big telltale sign, right? Am I just overloaded with information that I can't act on, or takes too long to act on, that I can't categorize, and that it's very human centric, right? Where I'm having to go in, or someone's having to go in and do the heavy lifting, or validate it, or triage, whatever it may be. So that's one big sign for me. The other is visibility gaps. We talked about VPN. If you're still using a corporate VPN, that is a huge blind spot for your organization. It allows almost no visibility, right? It is literally a virtual private tunnel being the key word. It is a black hole that data goes in and out of. So that's another thing. And I've talked to a lot of, especially mid-market organizations that are struggling to move away from that VPN architecture. And they're kind of looking at ZTNA, and the conversation we have is around, okay, if you're going to do that, make sure it's, really bound in security, not just the zero trust framework. If again, your organization has a huge SOC environment that is just become, I've seen SOCs that are, almost the size of the entire IT team, right? And that's largely because of the detect and respond responsibility that's been placed on them. Everything that they see is a red flashing light, and they're deciding, how do I go and tackle this? What's important? What isn't? So that, again, that human in the loop response largely means you're in a reactive environment.
Right.
So I think the key is really, if you can automate enforcement and not just detection, you're moving in the right direction.
If a company is still on a VPN, the question really is, what do they change first without too much disruption? Like, what is the first thing that they should focus on?
I mean, a VPN's an easy one, and it's I think low hanging fruit. So from my advice would be, hey, go find a ZTNA solution. Go find something that's going to give you visibility, control, connectivity, reliable connectivity in and out of your network. But do it in a way that also gives you, that hybrid user, right? So VPN is great for the remote user. What happens when I'm inside the network, right? Can I still get that same amount of visibility? That's really what I would say is if you're using VPN today, obviously, I think you should be moving away from that. I just think, it's a huge blind spot, but it is low hanging fruit. I mean, right. I've seen, VPN replacement turnups happen in 10 minutes across an organization.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, I think the time to deploy for solutions like that has gotten so much faster. So it's not this heavy lift that I think people typically think it is.
Right.
Outside of that, there's a lot of things you can do, right? Is you start to look at, where are the parts of my organization that I don't have visibility into. Outside, VPN obviously is one, but where else? Can I see lateral traffic across my organization? Can I see when a user is working from home, but then suddenly comes on the network? Do I have that same visibility for that user or the applications that they're accessing? Do I have visibility into the cloud infrastructure that they're accessing, right? So so many organizations now, especially some of the kind of newer organizations, have gone 100% cloud. All their applications are in the cloud, right? Yeah. They've moved away from that classic, data center footprint. But what they don't have is the visibility of what happens when that user connects to that cloud environment, right? So that's another thing I think to look at is okay, I think I'm a modern environment. I've got remote or hybrid users. We all connect to the cloud. The cloud is secure. Is that actually true? Is the data that's going in and out of that cloud environment, which now has become kind of where all your corporate secrets and your proprietary information is held? Are you sure that when that user connects, that there's nothing else in there in that session that could be potentially nefarious?
Okay, so bringing this sort of full circle back to AI, it's moving so fast. It's evolving so quickly. So looking ahead, how do you see threats further evolving?
I think what we'll start to see is a larger uses of AI by adversaries. I think we'll start to see more applications being built that look like you're logging into PayPal, but you're not, and they're going to be more sophisticated because they won't just be a web page anymore. It'll be like a full, like, oh, I've logged in and I can see what
Oh,
looks
wow.
like, that a full blown application. Because literally, with no coding experience, you could build something like that today.
Mhm.
And it's going to look very real. It's going to look like maybe your HR system or your accounting system, whatever it may be. That I think is one way. I also think, while I don't think the tactics and techniques are going to change necessarily, I think they're going to start to get melded together, where we're going to see lines of attack that are taking they're going to use AI to say, hey, solve this challenge for me. And here's the typical ways that we can get into an organization. And what you'll see is novel approaches using things that traditional cybersecurity solutions aren't going to necessarily see, because they may be looking at one particular tactic or one particular technique. What they're not looking at is, maybe it starts at the DNS layer and then it moves to the application layer. Or maybe it starts with an old technique that hasn't been used in a while, but it's a way that we can manipulate data or entry to gain access to do the things with a more novel technique. So I think those sorts of things are what we're going to start seeing in the future. I think things are just going to look more real to us.
Mhm.
We see constantly, we've kind of all caught up to the CAPTCHAs and things like
Yeah.
that. We can generally tell, don't click here, don't click on those spam pop-ups, but those are going to become more sophisticated, I think, with AI as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Scary thought. And so as that evolves, as that sort of security landscape evolves, what's going to separate the companies that adapt from the ones that fall behind?
I truly believe, organizations that take a step back and truly take a prevention first approach.
Mhm.
I think those that continue to stack their IT cybersecurity stack with detect and respond type of solutions are the ones that are going to continuously play catch up. And honestly, they're making it worse for themselves because they're just adding more alerting systems on
Yeah.
top of each other. If you can do real time enforcement versus after the fact response, that's going to give you a huge advantage. And I think if you're the CISO or the CIO and you start to look at, okay, like, can we be proactive? Are we able to reduce the amount of workload that we're placing on our SOC to go after these type of threats? Are we able to better spend our time on the things that really matter because we've reduced our alert workflow? From an AI perspective, I think organizations that treat them both as a tool and as a threat is going to be important, right?
Mhm.
Um, Make sure that you have visibility into the AI usage within your organization, but don't necessarily, you're never going to get by with saying no one can use AI. It's
Right.
just
It's
that
going to
that
happen.
ship has sailed. Yeah, as
Right.
we all know. They'll use it on their phone, they'll use it on their non-corporate device, they'll send something to their spouse and tell them to, put it into the LLM. So
Right.
AI usage is here to stay. I think we all know that. So I think if you can look at it as a kind of a two-headed monster, one being a tool for productivity increase and all the things that come along, app development, what have you, that's great. But you also need to be able to do AI enforcement, AI visibility, so that you have control over it. What can I stop what's going into an AI prompt? Can I stop a user from using app development tools? Can I limit the scope of what's being able to go into those AI tools, and what they connect to is hugely important. So I think that's kind of just bringing it back to AI. I think that's a big one. But really, moving from that preemptive into that kind of or moving from the reactive into the preemptive is really the biggest thing that you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the pace of change right now is so intense, and between AI and evolving threats and just the complexity of environments, everything that we just talked about, it feels like the gap between companies that figure this out and those that don't is going to widen really quickly. So I would love for you to share a little bit about what you do at Trinity Cyber, and how you can support companies who are facing this right now.
Sure. I mean, you probably heard me thread a little bit into that as we
Mhm.
as we went through, but I didn't want to throw the full court pitch or press to folks. But Trinity Cyber is basically an inline threat prevention solution. So what we basically do is what's called full content inspection and threat remediation. In simple terms, it basically means we take every single session, whether that's an outbound or inbound internet session, or it's an internal network session, we fully pull it apart. We look for anything that's malicious within that traffic. We basically pluck that out and then we repackage that session. What's cool about that is there is no median time to respond. That is done in line, basically in real time. So from a user's perspective, we're basically invisible. We allow business continuity because there's no time loss. We don't need to sandbox anything. There's nothing that's going to throw an alert. In fact, everything that we do is basically alertless. When we see something, we stop it and we notify you then of what we've stopped. So it's basically a detection and an action is what you would see if you were ever in our portal, for example. So, we kind of do that north, south, and east, west detection. And we also have deep visibility because we see the full session. We can see things from, I mentioned earlier, all the way from the DNS layer, all the way up to the application layer. So we can see multi-vector attacks. We can see things that, typical solutions can't. A really good example that we use all the time is we talked about email earlier and, kind of web building and things like that and using AI tools. Our solution, for example, if you click on a link in an email and it takes you to a malicious site that's running, say, something in JavaScript that's malicious, website owner may not even know it's there. And in fact, we see that quite often. The user goes to that site, and normally if somebody in security knows that site is malicious, they'll just block the URL. The example I always give is, well, what if that site's an airline and my flight just got canceled? Mm-hmm. And my corporate office or my firewall is blocking that site because there's malicious third-party JavaScript sitting on it. Like, that's business continuity that deeply affects my day-to-day operations. What we're able to do is basically identify within that website all of the code, look particularly at any line of code, and in this case would be malicious JavaScript, remove that from the website itself, but still deliver the clean website to the end user. So really cool in that respect.
That is really cool.
Yeah, it's something I've never seen before. It's one of the reasons that I love working at Trinity Cyber and the cool things that we're doing. So we're coming up with novel things like that every day, which just to me, gets me out of bed every morning.
Amazing. Yeah, this has been such a fantastic conversation, John. And I've learned so much from you just in the 30 plus minutes we've been chatting. So I know our audience is going to value this. What I'm really taking away from this is most organizations they're not necessarily underinvested in security. They're just operating in a model that really was built for a different time. And as AI accelerates both the threat landscape and how people work inside of organizations, that gap it's already getting hard to ignore. So I really appreciate you coming on and breaking this down in a way that's actually practical and usable, not just theory. This has been fantastic, John.
And I really appreciate the time. I had a great time.
Yes, me too. And if you're listening and this conversation resonated and you're starting to question whether your current approach is actually keeping up, that's why we built Technology Match. You can go to Technology Match and search by solution. You can type in Trinity Cyber and John's company and solutions will pop up for you where you could do a little bit of research. We'll link his pages in the show notes. We'll also link the Trinity Cyber website. And John, if people want to reach out directly, what's the best way to do that?
Email is always the easiest. john.fraser@trinitycyber.com.
Great. We'll link that in the show notes as well. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next time.